Hello, EE Scholars! Welcome to lesson number 5 in my Ecology and Evolution series. Today, we'll be going over rhythmic behavior, knockout in reference to genes, artificial selection, tropisms, taxes, migrations, and dispersal. Rhythmic behavior is defined as a specific behavior of an organism that recurs with measured regularity. This just means that the behavior happens in relation to some sort of schedule, like a sleeping schedule. Sleeping is an example of a rhythmic behavior because it happens regularly, every night or at least almost every night, and it happens at more or less the same time each night. This is, of course, assuming that there's no severe or irregular disruption. Rhythmic behaviors can have exogenous and/or endogenous factors. Exogenous means that the factor is external, while endogenous means that it's internal. Remember, in, or you could remember it as the X is out. Anyway, for sleeping, endogenous factors, or the internal factors, include things like neurotransmitters, while exogenous outer factors include things like light. Endogenous factors rely on something called a biological clock. A biological clock is the internal timing of certain behaviors. So at certain times, you naturally start to get tired. For the purposes of this class, there are two types of rhythmic behaviors, circadian and circannual. Circadian rhythms are rhythms with a period of about 24 hours. Circadian itself means about a day in Latin. Sleep is an example of a circadian rhythm because it repeats about every 24 hours. Circannual rhythms, on the other hand, are rhythms with a period of about 365 days or a year. An example of this would be migration, which happens on a seasonal basis. Our last term here, free running, is defined as behavior continuing on a regular cycle even in the absence of environmental cues. We'll see an example of this in a little bit, but first, let's go through the rest of our terms. The suprachiasmatic nucleus, abbreviated SCN, is a self-sustaining oscillator that controls circadian rhythms. Pretty much, it's the thing in your brain that controls your biological clock and times your circadian rhythms. It's located in a part of your brain called the hypothalamus, which controls things like heart rate, body temperature, and hunger. Entrain is a term that means to reset a behavioral rhythm with an external cue. Again, we'll see an example of this in a bit. Finally, a photoperiod is the number of hours of light in a 24-hour period. You can remember this by knowing that photo means light and period means an interval of time. So photoperiod is literally light in an interval of time. Okay, so now we're going to go back and go through some of these concepts more thoroughly. First, we'll start with circadian and circannual. As we said before, circadian means about a day and circannual means about a year. So while sleep is an example of a circadian rhythm, it can also be things like alertness, melatonin secretion, and more internal things. Now, when we say circadian rhythms, know that this doesn't necessarily mean an outward conscious behavior. It just means something that happens in, well, about a day. But another behavioral circadian rhythm would be something like eating. Some examples of circannual rhythms are things like migration, molting, breeding, hibernation, and flowering patterns. So let's do some practice identifying circadian and circannual rhythms. Many wild birds molt, shed their old feathers, most heavily in spring and fall, and they replace their lost feathers in the summer and winter. Is this an example of a circannual or circadian rhythm? It was circannual. Remember, the word circannual literally means about a year. And in what period do many wild birds molt? A period of a year. So molting is circannual. Say that we have a cat eating food. Is this behavior circadian or circannual? It is circadian. The cat hopefully eats every day. Recall that circadian means about a day. So that would make this behavior circadian behavior. Okay, last one. In humans, blood pressure is highest at about 6:30 p.m. Is this phenomenon circannual or circadian? This is an example of a circadian rhythm. In the example, we got one major clue, 6:30. 6:30 happens every day, so this would have to be a circadian rhythm. Alright, now we move on to free running. Just as a reminder, free running is defined as a behavior continuing on a regular cycle even in the absence of environmental cues. Let's take a look at this example. Jonas used to always go to bed at 9 o'clock, which was when it got dark. A little early, but I'll allow it. But since he closed his blinds, he's been staying up way later. And let's say that he has some really good blinds, so there's no light getting in. We can say that Jonas's sleep schedule is now free running. That's because it's continuing on a cycle that repeats about every 24 hours, even though it's independent of any external cues such as light. So free running is a behavior getting off track. To combat that, we have entrain. As stated earlier, entrain means to reset rhythms with an external cue. Let's look at the example. Over the summer, Jonas's sleep schedule had gotten way off track. It started free running. At one point, he'd wake up at 1 in the afternoon and go to bed at 7 in the morning. Then he reopened his blinds. Slowly, his sleep schedule began to resync with the day-night cycle. Alright, so in the previous example, we saw Jonas's sleep schedule start to undergo free running, or getting off track. But here we see it getting back on track. In other words, we see his sleep schedule being entrained. It had been free running, but now it's starting to sync up with external cues once again. So I just threw this in here to sort of show you what the suprachiasmatic nucleus does. On the left, we see a stimulus, light. This light gets processed by the SCN, which is located in the hypothalamus and is used as a cue for certain behaviors such as sleeping. Or in this case, not sleeping yet. Okay, that's enough about rhythmic behaviors. Now let's move on to knockout. Knockout, when we're referring to genes, is defined as the use of genetic engineering to inactivate or remove one or more specific genes from an organism. In short, scientists knock out one of the organism's genes in order to see how that will affect the organism. They can do this for a multitude of reasons, but it's usually to study the effects of a gene in reference to certain diseases, such as Parkinson's. They may use it for drug testing as well. Artificial selection is defined as a selection of certain organisms to breed with one another based on specific traits. A common example is dogs. Believe it or not, dogs are all actually one species, Canis familiaris. But one could make the mistake of assuming that they're somehow different because there are many breeds, each with their own distinct traits. You see, these breeds exist because at one point or another, humans bred certain dogs together based on their desirable traits. People then kept the trend going, and that eventually separated dogs into different breeds that we know and love today. So we only really have things like golden retrievers and chihuahuas because of artificial selection. Another example of this is Tryon's maze experiment. In the experiment, Tryon first took all of his rats and had them go through a maze. Then he took the ones who made it through the maze fastest and bred them together. He also did the same thing with those who went through the slowest. After many generations, he got the graph that we see here. You can see that the rats, based on their genes, are either good at the maze or not. You don't really have a whole lot in the middle. So that's another example of artificial selection. It's about time that we talk about tropisms. Tropism is a turning of all or part of an organism, which for our purposes is a plant, in a particular direction in response to an external stimulus. There's a few different types of tropisms. Some of them describe the stimulus, such as phototropism and gravitropism. In phototropism, the plant is moving in response to light, and in gravitropism, it's moving in response to gravity. There are also different terms to describe the plant's movement itself. Positive tropism is when the plant moves towards the stimulus, and negative tropism is when it moves away from it. Let's do some practice. A plant's roots grow towards water in the ground. This is known as hydrotropism. Hydro being water and tropism being, well, tropism. Is this an example of positive or negative hydrotropism? This was positive hydrotropism. In the example, it said that the plant's roots were growing towards the water, which was the stimulus. So if the plant is going towards the stimulus, then it's positive tropism. A singular plant does many things. In this picture, looking at the roots and the stem, identify the following: negative gravitropism, positive gravitropism, and positive phototropism. Bonus points if you can identify the negative phototropism in this picture too. In other words, find the part of the plant that each term describes. If you need extra time, feel free to pause the video. So, this question is asking a few things. In order to get the right answer, we have to look at A, the stimulus that it's asking for, and B, what part of that plant is moving in the way that the term is describing. Take positive gravitropism. What part of the plant was moving A in response to gravity and B in the direction of gravity? The roots were. Remember, gravity pulls down, so anything going down is in the direction of gravity. Now, what about negative gravitropism? The stem was going up, so it would be an example of this. The stem was going against gravity, which makes it negative. Finally, positive phototropism. Between the stem and the roots, what was growing towards the light? The stem, and of course leaves. I'd have taken either. And if you wanted to, you could say that the roots were an example of negative phototropism because they were going away from the light. So, you know how tropism applies to plants? Well, taxis is pretty much the same thing, but it applies to animals. Similar to tropism, taxis is defined as a reflexive movement by a freely moving organism, in this case animals, in relation to a stimulus. Just like tropisms, there are positive and negative taxis. Positive taxis go towards a stimulus and negative taxis move away. Alright, time for some practice. A moth moves towards the light. Is this positive or negative taxis? It was positive. In the example, the moth is moving towards the stimulus, in this case, light. Okay, last example for taxis. Whenever the light is switched on, cockroaches instinctively run for cover. Is this positive or negative taxis? This one was negative. Once again, the stimulus was light and cockroaches move away from light. So, in summary, the main difference between tropisms and taxis is that taxis are for animals and tropisms are for plants. In both, an organism moves either towards or away from a stimulus. Finally, we move on to migration and dispersal, which is on the next slide. Migration is defined as the seasonal movement of animals from one region to another. Migratory animals include certain birds, turtles, butterflies, and so on. Dispersal, in contrast, is the movement of an individual or multiple individuals from the population in which they were born to another location or population where they will settle and reproduce. All of this is a really long way to say that they go somewhere and, unlike in migration, they don't come back. So, like a one-way trip. There are two major categories of dispersal, aeolian plankton and foracy. In aeolian plankton, organisms disperse through the use of currents. In other words, water currents or air currents or any other type of currents carry the organism to somewhere new. In foracy, organisms disperse via another organism. Let's look at some examples. A female wasp is carried to a new area by a male and he leaves her there. Is this migration or dispersal? If it's dispersal, what type of dispersal is it? It was dispersal, more specifically foracy. In the example, the male left the female in a location and it says nothing about him coming back for her. We can also assume that she's incapable of traveling long distances since she needed to use another organism to get there in the first place. So, simply put, she is not returning anytime soon. Now, we can tell that this is foresty because a female traveled to the new location via her mate, which is another organism. Let's try another example. A butterfly flies south for the winter. Is this migration or dispersal? If it's dispersal, what type of dispersal is it? It was migration. Notice how the example said for the winter. That indicates that the butterfly at least had the intention to return, and if it returns, then that would make it migration. Dandelion seeds are carried away by the wind. Is this migration or dispersal? If it's dispersal, what type of dispersal is it? It was aeolian plankton, which is a type of dispersal. In the example, the seeds were carried by air currents instead of something like another organism, which probably aren't going to carry them back to the original location. So, dispersal. And remember, dispersal by currents is called aeolian plankton. Okay, last example. An organism is infected with worms, which lay eggs in this system. When those eggs hatch and mature, they exit the organism through waste. Is this migration or dispersal? If it's dispersal, what type of dispersal is it? It was foresty. Once the parasites exit the organism, they probably aren't going back in. And even if they did, they probably wouldn't go back to the same location. So, dispersal. And of course, since they use another organism, it's foresty instead of alien plankton. Alright, we've finally reached the end. So, to review, there are two main types of rhythmic behavior: circadian, about a day, and circannual, about a year. Terms associated with rhythmic behaviors are entrain, photoperiod, free running, and the suprachiasmatic nucleus. Two different methods that scientists use to test the relationship between genes and behavior are knockout and artificial selection. Tropism involves movement in plants, while taxis refers to movement in animals. And finally, migration is when an organism goes somewhere new and comes back, while dispersal is when an organism goes somewhere else and stays there. The two types of dispersal are foresty and aeolian plankton. And that concludes our 5th lesson for ecology and evolution. I hope that you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you next time.